Welcome and thank you for joining the Middle States Commission on Higher Education today as we hear from the American Council on Education's Terry Hartle, who I will introduce in just a moment. But first, we want to acknowledge our sponsor for this event, Academic Search. For more than 4 decades, Academic Search has been partnering with higher education institutions and associations to assemble the best teams possible. Their mission is to enhance institutional capacity by providing outstanding executive recruitment services, executive coaching, and transition support in collaboration with its parent organization, American Academic Leadership Institute. Learn more at academicsearch.org. On this screen is the Commission's disclaimer that the reproduction, distribution, or transmission of this presentation in part or in whole is expressly prohibited without prior consent from the Commission. Please follow the instructions for permission requests. We know you will have a significant amount of questions for today's featured speaker, Terry Hartle. So we encourage you to use the Q&A function to submit those throughout the program. We will get to as many of them as we possibly can at the end of Terry's remarks. I am so pleased to welcome and introduce Terry Hartle. As most of you know, Terry is one of America's most effective and experienced advocates for higher education. At ACE, where he has served for more than 25 years, he directs comprehensive efforts to engage federal policymakers on a broad range of issues, including student aid, government regulation, scientific research, and tax policy. His work involves representation before the U.S. Congress, administrative agencies, and the federal courts. As an expert voice on behalf of colleges and universities, Terry is quoted widely in the national and international media on higher education issues. Terry has always been a friend to the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, where he has frequently served as a popular plenary speaker at our annual conferences and has engaged with us on important issues impacting the higher education community and, in particular, institutions within our membership. On behalf of the Commission, it is my privilege to welcome Terry Hartle and to turn over the program to him at this time.
Well, thanks very much, Heather, for those kind words, and thanks very much to Middle States for asking me to spend a little time with you today. I bring greetings from Washington, D.C., where it's a lovely spring day, and I hope all of you are enjoying weather as good as we have today in Washington. I thought before we jumped into the substance of where things are with respect to higher education policy, it would be good to step back a little bit and talk about the big picture, where things stand in Washington, D.C. So let's start with the story so far. There are two fundamental facts of life that, political life, that define what's going on in Washington these days. First, the Democrats have limited control on Capitol Hill. Democrats control both the House and Senate, but they have no room for error. They have a margin of 3 seats in the House and a margin of 0 seats in the Senate. They control the Senate only because Vice President Harris, as in her role as presiding officer, will break tie votes. But the Democrats, to get things done on Capitol Hill, have to work in one of 2 ways. Either they have to find at least 10 Republicans who will work with them on any given issue in the Senate, or they have to get all the Democrats to line up and support whatever policy it is that the House and Senate leadership want to move forward. In the Senate, for example, this would mean that John Tester and Joe Manchin and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, for example, would all have to agree on what legislation is going to look like. There is simply no margin for error if they're only going to depend on Democratic votes to get stuff done. Whether or not they can get Republican votes seems to be an open question. Very few Republicans, no Republicans voted for the American Rescue Plan, the first COVID supplemental proposal of the Biden administration. And there's not much reason to suspect that we're going to see a lot of Republicans suddenly willing to cross the aisle to get things done. So first political fact of life is the Democrats have limited control. A second fact of life is that the Democrats are off to a slow start in filling positions in the executive branch. The Washington Post and the Partnership for Public Service have been tracking the progress of the Biden administration in filling the 800 most senior executive branch positions that require presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. Of those 800 positions, the Biden administration has named 199 people, so almost 25%, but they've only confirmed 45 people. So roughly 5% of the positions have been filled. 150 are under consideration on Capitol Hill, and there are a few who have been named but not yet formally nominated. This means that there are 600 of the most senior positions in the executive branch that do not even have someone named yet to fill those positions. This is important because you need presidentially appointed Senate confirmed nominees to run the executive branch, particularly if you want to do lots of things in the executive branch. You need those people in place. The sooner you get them in place, the sooner you can start doing things that you want to do. Mind you, the agencies all have talented and energetic people staffing them in political staff roles, but the policymakers, the ones who require presidential nomination and Senate confirmation, aren't coming along very quickly. Department of Education, we have one person, Secretary Miguel Cardona, who has been confirmed. We have two people who are awaiting confirmation, Deputy Secretary Cindy Martin and Undersecretary James Cavall. We're hoping that they will be confirmed this month, but it's taking a while to get key people in place, and this will slow down the speed with which the executive branch can move. I've already mentioned the American Rescue Plan. This is the first COVID stimulus package put out by the administration. Congress passed this in March, $1.9 trillion, including $40 billion going to colleges and universities and our students. The Department of Education today has announced its guidance for colleges and universities to spend money under the American Rescue Plan. The big news here is that the administration has said that all enrolled students will be eligible to receive funds. This means that Dreamers and international students can, if the institution chooses, receive funds under the American Rescue Act. This is a change from where we were in the first two COVID supplementals. The Trump administration had restricted eligibility, and Dreamers and international students were not eligible. That is about to change. The American Jobs Act, I'll talk about this in a second. That is the second of President Biden's COVID supplementals. Speaker Pelosi has said she wants to pass this in the House by the 4th of July. There are a number of provisions in there that would affect colleges and universities, and I'll talk about that. The Biden administration's also now laid out the outlines of the American Families Plan. This is the third of the Biden administration's COVID packages. This gets to the Building Back Better idea that President Biden talked about during the campaign. That one is further away. We've got the outline of what the Biden administration wants in it, but no details. And another sort of political fact of life in Washington is that we have an election coming. As already mentioned, the Democrats enjoy narrow control in the House and Senate. Republicans are convinced that they will take back control of both chambers in the November 2022 elections. So a lot of what's going on now is sort of positioning both parties to be in the best possible position in the fall elections. We never really stop campaigning in Washington, D.C., and particularly with Congress so closely controlled, it's a very challenging atmosphere to get things done based solely on the merits and short-term political considerations. We have to now consider elections as well. A big difference between where we are now and where President Obama was in 2009. I mentioned that President Biden has a margin of 0 in the Senate and 3 in the House. President Obama had a margin of 10 in the Senate and 70 in the House. At this point in 2009, Republicans did not think they had a chance to take back the House in the midterm elections. And of course, they ended up doing just that because they drew very strong lines of disagreement with the Obama administration, gave the Obama administration very little support for their major initiatives, and were able to take back control of the House and Senate. Some people think that's a playbook for what the Republicans are trying to do at the present time. I don't know. Certainly no one would say, but we're dealing with a pretty complicated and challenging political environment to get things done for the Biden administration. Let's go to the next slide. The Biden administration during the campaign talked about 5 things they wanted to do in higher education. First, they talked about some regulatory changes they wanted to make to things like Title IX. They also talked about increasing support for historically Black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions. They talked about doubling the Pell Grant program. They talked about loan forgiveness. Then they talked about free college. All in all, this was the biggest higher education agenda we had ever seen. In a presidential nominee, it would be an enormous investment in human capital if the Biden administration is able to pull this off. But those were their major objectives. I'm going to come back to where we stand on these things in just a second. But having passed the American Rescue Plan, let's stop for a second. What's going to happen next in Washington? Let's go to the next slide. The Senate is trying to produce legislation to deal with issues related to China and national security, how the U.S. can better position itself to compete with China going forward. Partly this is about investing in research and technology, particularly critical technologies like artificial intelligence. Partly it's about tightening the way we do things in the U.S. to ensure that people who wish us harm do not have access to America's most important research and highest levels of technology. So there's a balance here. The Senate is trying to do this. They're trying to do it in a bipartisan fashion, and it's not going as smoothly as they might have hoped. Interestingly, both parties want to do something about China and to protect national and economic security, but they can't agree on what those somethings should be. Next thing up, the American Jobs Act. This is what's under consideration in the House. As I mentioned, Speaker Pelosi has said she hopes to bring this to a vote in the House before the 4th of July recess. So there's a little bit of time. But having announced this a couple of months ago, the House is not making a lot of obvious progress, at least not visible progress, in terms of putting together a legislative package that we have been able to see. But that's where the House hopes to go next. Immigration and Dreamers are very much on the radar screen. The challenge here is, as it has always been, that Dreamers probably enjoys a fair amount of popular support by themselves, but nobody wants to start picking various immigration-related issues and doing them separately. So there is a tension between doing small individual bills that enjoy bipartisan support and comprehensive immigration reform. There is legislation that's passed the House to deal with immigration. It's stalled in the Senate. In the Senate, Dick Durbin, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, wants to do something about Dreamers. The challenge he faces here is to get the legislation considered on the floor of the Senate. He needs to find 10 Republicans who are willing to agree to move forward on the legislation. And as of yet, he doesn't have them. If he gets 10 Republicans, he'll move pretty quickly. I think part of the challenge Durbin is going to face is that the situation on the Texas border is not as desirable as the administration would want it to be. They are close to being overwhelmed by a surge of refugees, and they're stumbling to try and get their arms around this in a reasonably humane fashion. So this is a challenge that Durbin is going to face in trying even to raise the legislation to be dealing with Dreamers. Two things that are very much out there, but unclear in terms of when we'll hear more about them. The American Families Plan, as I mentioned, this is the third of President Biden's COVID supplemental spending bills. The other thing that's sort of out there is the fiscal year 2022 budget. This will be another vehicle for the Biden administration to indicate what their policy priorities are across the board. Let's go to the next slide. Let's start with the American Jobs Act. As I mentioned, this is something that the president announced a few weeks ago. Major elements of the American Jobs Act, $250 billion in research funding. Included in that $250 billion is $45 billion for R&D at historically Black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions. Minority-serving institutions is the general term here. It would include tribal colleges. It would include Hispanic-serving institutions. It would include Pacific Islander and Alaskan Native institutions. There's no legal definition of minority-serving institutions. It's something everybody thinks they understands, but it would be all of those institutions that are identified as particularly serving minority students. $45 billion for R&D at those institutions. The American Jobs Act would include $12 billion to help build and repair and restore infrastructure at community colleges. And it would include $100 billion in workforce retraining. Now, remember, one of the themes of the Biden administration is to improve training and retraining opportunities for individuals, particularly individuals in economically depressed areas that have seen significant economic changes take good jobs away. At least some of that workforce retraining money would be spent on college and university campuses, particularly community colleges. But that's what's in the Job Act: research funding, infrastructure at community colleges, workforce retraining. If you think back to that slide I presented initially, the only thing on the list of the Biden priorities that shows up in here is the funding for HBCUs and minority-serving institutions. I mentioned Speaker Pelosi hopes to have this through the House by the 4th of July, but as yet, a draft legislation has not emerged very quickly. Let's go to the next slide. I mentioned the American Families Plan. This is the most recent COVID supplemental plan put forward by the Biden administration. There's a number of things in here that address the priority list that the Biden team laid out in the campaign. First, a $1,400 increase in the maximum Pell Grant, and Dreamers would be made eligible for the first time to receive Pell Grants. Obviously, widespread support for that in the community. It is not a doubling of the Pell Grant. The Biden administration calls it a down payment on doubling. Second thing in the American Families Plan is free community college, along with tuition subsidies at historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions for students in their first 2 years. Again, free college was one of the key elements in the Biden higher education agenda during the campaign, and it shows up in here. Two things that they didn't really talk about too much in the campaign, but that are, find their way into the American Families Plan. They want to vastly expand student support services to try and improve access, retention, and completion. The proposal here is for about $60 billion in spending. And in addition, There is a proposal in here for teacher preparation and retention. The teacher preparation part of this obviously has implications for colleges and universities. Retention is more of an elementary secondary issue, but we're looking at about $9 billion for teacher preparation and retention. As I said, the Biden administration has laid this out in general terms. In some cases, there are pieces of legislation that they can point to that were introduced in previous Congresses that sort of consistent with what they have in mind, but details are scarce on this. The American Families Plan probably doesn't emerge until sometime this fall. The first thing up is going to be the American Jobs Plan. And the challenge there for the Democrats will be in the Senate. Do we work with Republicans and try to attract 10 of them? Do we break out the parts of the American Jobs Act that we know are politically popular, like infrastructure, and do those separately? They will then have to ask themselves, well, if we can't get 10 Republican supporters, can we find a legislative shortcut to pass this where we don't have to worry about the 60 vote rule? So these are the very difficult political calculations that overlay the substantive issues that the administration wants to wrestle with. It's both substance and politics that complicate the efforts to move things forward. Let's go to the next slide, if we could, please. The 2022 budget, the federal fiscal year starts on October 1st. The Congress has to pass a budget or temporary spending bills by October 1st, or the agencies close. First thing you need to know about the 2022 budget is that it is way late. Normally, we see the president's budget the first week in February. We're obviously getting to the middle of May and still haven't seen it. There was talk that we might see it next week. We're now hearing that it might slip another week beyond that. So we can be to Memorial Day or into June before we see the 2022 budget. Funding government agencies never goes smoothly. It has to be done every year. It's always difficult and contentious. Delaying the start of the budget and appropriations process by 3 months is not going to help them get it done by October 1st, when the new fiscal year starts. My guess is we'll get to October, we'll see temporary spending bills, and we won't see a final fiscal year 2022 budget until December. I think this will be one of the last things they do before they get out of town. They will have to do something about it. It's must-pass legislation, but they're not getting a timely start on it, and that's going to complicate efforts to get it done in any sort of a remotely timely fashion. We haven't seen the budget yet. The administration published an outline of their budget in Washington parlance. This was called a skinny budget. It identified some of their priorities for fiscal year 2022. They asked for an additional $400 Pell increase. This would be on top of the $1,400 that they asked for in the American Jobs Act. So we're in the American Families Act. So we're looking at an $1,800 proposed increase in the maximum Pell award. Again, no doubling, but a substantial increase in maximum Pell funding. One area of the budget that would get doubled, Title I. This is elementary, secondary education. The federal government gives money to states to provide to schools educating low-income elementary and secondary school students. The Biden administration has proposed to double funding for that program, which would cost about $20 billion. Once again, the skinny budget, the administration has indicated that they will provide, ask for additional institutional support for HBCUs and minority serving institutions. This will be on the order of $600 million. So this theme of support for historically Black colleges, universities, other minority serving institutions is going to be something that's really going to be a theme of this administration in just about everything that they do. A question mark simply reflects the uncertainty about when we will actually see the budget. and how Congress will arrange itself to try to move the budget process forward, and then how they will try to make decisions on how much money gets allocated to every specific program. Getting a federal budget together is a complicated annual process, never runs smoothly. It's always late. That's going to be, again, the case this year. But the one thing about the budget process is Congress has to pass these bills. This is must pass legislation. So it is very possible that the appropriations bill could become a vehicle for doing some of the other things that the administration wants to do, but doesn't have the 60 votes to accomplish in the Senate. We will see. The basic rules for the getting stuff done in Washington for the Biden administration are you do regular order, which requires 60 votes to bring things up and consider them in the Senate, or you look for a parliamentary shortcut, like the budget process, like the appropriations and spending process. That's the challenge the Biden team is going to face. Let's move on to the next slide if we can. I mentioned regulatory action was one of the things that the Biden administration talked about a lot during the campaign. And there are a lot of regulatory actions that we can tee up here. A general rule is that anything done by executive branch action in one administration can be overturned by another administration without going through Congress. The corollary here is that how it was put in place determines how it can be undone. Some things like executive orders, proclamations, regulatory guidance, which is informal, can be overturned by the stroke of a pen. Other things, particularly things that have been put in place pursuant to a full regulatory process, can only be taken away by a full regulatory process. So it's things can be taken away that the Trump administration put in place. In some cases, they can be taken away quickly, not in all cases. Some of the early regulatory steps that they have taken will help colleges and universities. You know, one regulatory step was they restored the DACA program. Second regulatory step was they repealed the Trump administration's executive order on race and sex stereotyping, which was going to make it difficult for private sector organizations to talk about those issues and to try to address some of them. So some of the early steps will help colleges and universities. The Department of Education, many of the things that are of most concern at the Department of Education are going to have to go through a regulatory process. And some of the things will have to go through a particularly complicated regulatory process called negotiated rulemaking. Negotiated rulemaking is even slower than the usual regulatory process. First up, Title IX, the Trump administration's regulation on sexual assault. These were put in place through a regulatory process. The Biden administration is going to have to use a regulatory process to repeal them. So until that regulatory process is in place, the Title IX regulations issued by the Trump administration last August are in effect. There are some people who wonder if the Biden administration might go easy on enforcement of the Title IX regulations because there are areas that the Biden administration doesn't like. One, the Biden administration would never publicly acknowledge that they were going to do that. And two, even if they did do that, the Trump regulations are the law of the land, and people who don't follow them can be sued by individuals seeking relief. So right now, the Trump regulations are in place. My own guess is it'll be at least 2 years before we see substantial changes to the Title IX regulations that'll modify what you're currently doing on college and university campuses. There are a couple of other areas that the Biden administration wants to deal with and will deal with. Borrower defense and gainful employment. Borrower defense, circumstances under which borrowers don't have to repay their student loans. They're going to rewrite the Trump regulations in this area. Gainful employment, to give consumers information about economic returns of programs at post-secondary education institutions. They are going to have to put those regulations back in place. Both of those regulations will have to go through the negotiated rulemaking process, which is an even more complicated version of the regular regulatory process. They're going to have to make some changes to the 90-10 regulations, particularly those regulations affect veterans' benefits. This is going to require negotiated rulemaking. Next slide. FAFSA simplification, something that the Congress approved in December. This is going to require some negotiated rulemaking to simplify the FAFSA as dramatically as the administration wants. Those 3 or 4 things, borrower defense, gainful employment, 90-10, FAFSA simplification, all are under negotiated rulemaking. Presumably, all of those could be done through one negotiated rulemaking process, but it would be a very complicated process because you'd have to have an adequate number of people around the table who could speak to and comment knowledgeably about all of those matters. One of the questions that comes up, are they going to do anything on accreditation? The short answer is we don't know. The Trump administration changed accreditation regulations. These were controversial when the Trump administration put them in place, but controversy seems to have abated. I haven't heard a lot of people talking about this as a top tier priority for regulatory changes in the Biden administration. It could be, but they've got these other regulations that they're going to have to deal with first before they can turn to other things that they might well like to do. So in the short term, I don't think we see significant changes coming in accreditation. It's possible, but it doesn't seem to be at the top of the list of things that they're going to turn to when they get their people in place and begin to move in the direction of changing regulations. Finally, another area of great concern, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, immigration visas, international students. This was obviously an area of great activity by the Trump administration. By one count, more than 400 executive branch actions put in place to deal with this constellation of issues. The Biden administration will be looking at all of them. They'll be taking some other steps. But the fact of the matter is that student visas and foreign scholars are not necessarily at the top of that list. This is a case where you're waiting to get the people in the executive branch who can say, this is what we're going to do. We don't have all of those people in place yet. I can tell you based on our conversations that the Biden administration is very much aware of these issues. They are very aware that May, June, and July are critically important months, particularly for student visas for the fall semester. I can also tell you that it's one thing in a very long list of things that they feel that they need to deal with. Next slide, please. Looking past the immediate situation in Washington, what's going to happen over the next, let's say, 6 months, I can sort of tell you what's out there, what the pieces that might come into play are. Can't necessarily tell you when and which ones, but we can sort of identify the major elements that are sort of visible in the public policy arena. But I want to end by just sort of sharing with you 3 areas where I think higher education needs to be aware of things that could be problems going forward. First, the grievance, resentment, anti-elitism, and the toxic politics of the era that we are living in is a very big problem for any industry, all industries. Americans now tend to look at businesses and organizations and industries and say, is this on my side or is this on the other side? Does this industry business work on my behalf or is it hurting me? And a lot of independents and Republicans look at higher education and say, these are elite institutions that aren't doing anything for me or my family. I don't believe that, but it is a very real feeling among many Republicans. And I think it's incredibly, it has the possibility to be incredibly damaging to colleges and universities going forward. So we need to be aware of that. We are somewhat caught in the middle. We are perceived as leaning to the left, and therefore Republicans and most independents are increasingly skeptical of colleges and universities. Second issue of concern, disappearing low-income students. The data about the pandemic and what's happened to enrollment over the last 18 months, very worrisome in terms of the number of low-income students enrolled in post-secondary education. That's been falling. Biden administration wants to get them back. Democrats are very anxious to get them back. What we're not sure is what public policies would help get those individuals back. We don't know if this is a blip or if this is a fundamental change, that low-income students are just simply not enrolling in post-secondary education. We'll get a better indication in the fall as we hope we see a return to a more normal environment. But low-income students have always been underrepresented despite all the efforts the federal government and institutions have made. They are increasingly underrepresented over the last 18 months. Finally, student debt and the cost of college. This is an evergreen issue. This is something that all members of Congress are aware of. This is the thing I hear most about when I talk to members of Congress and their staff. This is a thing that comes up most frequently in talking with the media. Why does college cost so much? Why are students borrowing so much to pay for it? Over the last decade, the cost of college has gone up about 20%, public and private, 2-year and 4-year. If you weight it for enrollment, the real gain in the cost of college is about 20%. The real increase in average debt by students who borrow is closer to 80%. So an awful lot of students are borrowing money to pay for college that goes far beyond what we might expect given changes in college prices. So there's probably a fair amount of borrowing for consumption that has been taking place. But we've got these two trend lines. Both are going up much faster than family income. One is college and university tuition. The other is student debt. And those are problems that we really need to recognize as something that requires the attention of leaders on every college and university campus. So I will stop there, Heather. If there's time for questions or comments or dialogue, I'd be very happy to engage in it. Thanks again for having me with you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry, for your remarks and your insights as the higher education community navigates a new administration. And we all try to understand the policy and regulatory changes that may impact institutions, students, and accreditors. So we appreciate those remarks. As a reminder to our audience, if you have questions for Terry, we see several in the Q&A already. We ask that you submit questions through the Q&A function, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. Before I ask our first question, I again want to thank our sponsor, Academic Search, for helping bring this informative program to our constituents. I also want to remind our viewers to follow us on social media. And now we will move on to our questions. So I know, Terry, you spoke a little bit about Title IX, and I want to circle back to that. If you could talk with institutional representatives about how they can lend their voice to this process.
Sure. Well, this will, as I said, have to go through a full regulatory process. The Trump administration did that to put their regulations in place. The one thing that institutions and anyone who is concerned with the regulations can do is be sure that your voice is heard by submitting comments in the process. Now, when the Trump administration did this, they got 130,000 comments. A normal Department of Education regulation gets about 2,000 comments. So part of the reason this is going to be a slower process than usual is, one, the issues that you are dealing with are very hard, and two, there is enormous public interest, and the Department of Education has to show that they have at least considered all of the comments that have been raised. They don't have to agree with them or support them, but they have to show that they have considered them. So this is an extraordinarily big regulatory process. It's just going to take time. Department of Education has announced that they're going to do a public hearing on this starting on June 7th. I believe Middle States has shared with you the registration materials. The department has not yet activated the site, so you can't register to participate in this if you want. You will be able to do that at some point in the not too distant future. What I would encourage institutions in particular to do is to identify the 3, 4, 5, 6 top concerns that you have and to focus on those. And I would keep banging away at your top concerns, because one thing that's very important here with so many people commenting is that the department clearly understands what the issues are that concern colleges and universities. ACE is preparing something that we will submit as part of this. It will identify the 5 or 6 cross-cutting issues that we have heard about from colleges and universities. I've got a team member working on this already because it's very important for us. And I'd encourage institutions that are worried about this, from whatever perspective you are worried about it, to prepare themselves to comment as often and as vigorously as possible.
Great, thank you for that, Terry. So we have several questions coming in, and one is asking for you to speak to the possibility of the reauthorization of the Higher Education Opportunity Act.
Forget it. Is that simple enough? Look, the Higher Education Reauthorization is an extraordinarily complicated piece of legislation. It's 1,000 pages long. Reauthorizing the Higher Education Act used to be a normal part of the public policy process. There are very few normal parts of the public policy process anymore, and particularly complicated bills face a steep uphill climb if they need to be rewritten. And that's where we are with the Higher Education Reauthorization. It's now about 8 years overdue. I don't see much likelihood that this Congress is going to make any progress in reauthorizing the Higher Education Act. I say that with dismay, because the law is increasingly obsolete in terms of what goes on college and university campuses. But the fact of the matter is that to rewrite a complicated piece of legislation, you need some level of bipartisan cooperation in the House and the Senate, particularly in the Senate, and we just don't see that bipartisan cooperation yet. In the last Congress, Senator Lamar Alexander, now retired, was desperately anxious to reauthorize the higher education. Patty Murray, now the chair of the Senate Help Committee, was then the ranking Democrat on the committee. And those are two old-time legislators. They wanted to get stuff done. But even the two of them, with all their experience and desire to really work on behalf of the public, couldn't produce a bill that they could take to their committee. And so part of me thinks, look, if Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray can't do it, could anybody do it? And I just think the likelihood of a reauthorization is pretty limited. We did see some action in the direction of a reauthorization in the last Congress when we simplified the FAFSA, made a couple of other changes in December. But you know, that's never as satisfactory as completely rewriting the law to address the broad panoply of things that need attention. So if you're a betting person, bet against the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act.
Great, thanks for that, Terry. There's a question in the Q&A function that it seems that there is a need for some form of enduring hybrid of presence and virtual education. Are you hearing anything about or seeing emerging enabling policies that would facilitate that?
And the short answer is no. Um, I think that this is something that anyone on a college or university campus is acutely aware of. That college and universities proved remarkably nimble over the last 15 months in changing the way in which they delivered education. Colleges and universities learned a great deal about what works well virtually, what doesn't work as well, regardless of the sort of way they were offering education in the past. I think all institutions have sort of gotten a new appreciation for some things that they might be able to do differently. So I suspect over the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot of individual institutions drawing lessons for themselves. And I think over time, the public policy community will start to say, here are three or four things that would be particularly helpful by ways of changing public policy to enable institutions and students to benefit from the experience that we had as a result of delivering education during the pandemic. We're not quite there yet. We will get there. And I think one of the things that would be helpful to people like me and others in Washington who represent college universities is to hear from you about the things that worked, the things that didn't work well, what you might try to incorporate on a more regular basis into your academic programs. We need to try to understand from the perspective of the whole community, lessons that we can learn, and two, how we might apply those lessons to federal policy going forward. But that's not going to be quick. That's not going to be easy. Frankly, if anybody tried to do it now, they'd probably get it wrong. But we need to ask ourselves those questions and begin to think about them.
Great, thank you for that. There's a question also asking about support for increasing CNCS funding for service learning. And do you anticipate any increases in funding that would contribute to supporting expanded service learning opportunities, ultimately that could benefit higher education and the K-12 pipeline?
The Democrats like this a lot. This area of public policy tends to do much better under Democratic administrations than it does under Republican administrations, notwithstanding the fact that many Republicans themselves are strong supporters of this. So I would suspect the possibility for increased funding here is very good. But I don't see it at the top of the priority list either of the Biden administration or folks on Capitol Hill just yet. You know, any new administration starts off, they've got new ideas, new initiatives they want to run. Sometimes they will say, look, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put a lot more money into this program. You're seeing that, for example, with the Pell Grant program. But we haven't got to that point yet with service learning. So I think it remains popular. I think the possibility there is for an increase, but it's not a top level priority at the present time of anybody that I'm talking to.
So Terry, we have two questions in the Q&A relating to the 90-10 rule. One is asking, could you talk a little bit more about the 90-10 rule generally? And the other is asking, is the only possible change the one you mentioned relating to veterans benefits?
The likely change is the one dealing with veterans benefits because the statute has changed and so the regulations have to change to keep up with it. In a negotiated rulemaking process, the negotiators can decide to tee up other issues related to 90-10. One of the challenges here, as I mentioned, is every negotiated rulemaking process requires the creation of a panel of negotiators and federal negotiators, non-federal negotiators and federal negotiators. These panels meet 3 or 4 times over 4 or 5 months. These panels attempt to actually draft regulations that everybody will agree to. The makeup of the panels is a key question. Rarely do you take an issue like 90-10, and that's the only issue that this panel addresses. Panels typically have 20 to 24 people on them. I think the Department of Education will probably try to do one negotiated rulemaking session that is both borrowed defense and gainful employment, They'll factor in 90-10 as well to that, and the FAFSA simplification. Now, it's possible the department could say, look, we're going to do bar defense and gainful employment in one negotiated rulemaking session, and we'll do another one that will include 90-10, FAFSA simplification, maybe some other stuff like accreditation. But that doubles the workload on the Department of Education. Doing negotiated rulemaking is an extraordinary burden for the department to organize and to pull off. The Department of Education is not the organization that it was in 4 years ago. Department of Education has about 25% fewer career civil servants than they had at the start of the Trump administration. This means they just don't have the bodies in place to do all the things that they might want to do. And some of the initial signs that I look at suggest it's going to take even longer than we might have anticipated. Personally, I would have thought we would have seen guidance on the American Rescue Plan funds before now. Because the American Rescue Plan funds didn't represent a huge change from what we had under CARISA, the COVID relief supplemental bill enacted in December 2020 under the Trump administration. So I just think it's going to be a lot harder for the Department of Education to get things done, simply because things in a bureaucracy always take a long time. And when you have lost career staff, when you don't have your when you don't have your political appointees in place, it's just that much harder to get stuff done. So could they go beyond what the statutory changes were with respect to 90-10 and therefore veterans benefits? Absolutely. Will they? That's very much an open question.
Thanks, Terry. Another question that we have, circling back to student debt forgiveness, is there a discussion about including Parent Plus loans in some of the activities around student debt forgiveness?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. If you notice, I mentioned loan forgiveness as one of the things that the Biden administration talked about during the campaign. Both President Biden and Vice President Harris talked about debt forgiveness. This is a very popular issue, particularly with the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. The most common proposal is to forgive $100,000 in debt for everyone who is currently repaying a federal student loan. Doing that, we estimate, would cost $350 billion right away. It would cost more money to do that than it would take to double the Pell Grant program over a decade. So part of the challenge here is just that it's so much money that's involved. One of the sort of pushing and shoving things that's going on right now is many liberals on Capitol Hill think that the Biden administration has the legislative authority to cancel student loans already. That is, they say the Biden administration could just announce, we're canceling this much in student loans for everybody who is repaying it. The Biden administration so far has said, no, we don't think we have that authority. We would like to have that authority, but you have to pass a law to give it to us. If Congress were to pass a law, assuming they could get the bipartisan compromise to do it, it would cost Congress $350 billion, as I mentioned, to forgive $10,000 in debt. In the budgetary rules that make sense only in Washington, if the Biden administration were to do that unilaterally, it wouldn't cost anything. So part of the challenge here is that Congress wants the Biden administration to do it, liberals in particular want the Biden administration to do it, but they're not sure that this is where they would spend $350 billion. These discussions are going to go on. The Biden administration has announced that Richard Cordray, former head of the Consumer Finance Bureau, will be the head of student aid in their administration. It's a very high level, very senior appointment of a guy who's very close to Elizabeth Warren and knows a great deal about financial products and consumers. So the issue is still very much out there. But if you think about the American Rescue Plan that I talked about, the American Jobs Act, the American Families Plan, large-scale debt forgiveness doesn't show up in any of those. So I don't know what that portends for the future, but the Biden team hasn't put forward a path to get there yet. There are some things that they can do, some things that they will do. They can and will try to make the public service loan forgiveness program work. They have already canceled 92,000 loans for students who were swindled by ITT and Corinthian. So they've taken some steps. They're going to take some other steps. Whether they're going to act unilaterally, whether they're going to propose that Congress act on large-scale debt forgiveness, I can't say. When people talk about debt forgiveness, they are usually talking about former student borrowers, not so much about parent borrowers. Doesn't mean parents couldn't be included, but most of the conversations are about the impact that student debt has on recent college graduates and their opportunities to move forward in life. The assumption being if we cancel their debt, it would be financially beneficial to them. They would take that money and spend it on consumer goods and services and boost the economy. So the focus is really on over-debted young graduates than on everybody who's repaying a student loan. Again, plus loans could be considered. I haven't heard much talk about them as being part of the puzzle.
Great. Well, as we suspected, Terry, we have many more questions that we're not going to be able to get to because we are out of time. But on behalf of the commission and all of our constituents, I again want to thank you for being with us today. I know that I speak for everyone when I say that we hope to be able to do this in person in the future as we continue to invite you back to engage with all of us. To all of our viewers, we wish that you remain safe and well, and please do not hesitate to call on our commission if you need assistance or if you have questions that we can answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.